It's a glass jar full of tiny lights on a copper wire that's just been dipped in plastic.
Cool.
And it's not actually intended to be a background piece. It is intended to be the nightlight of this room so that I don't trip over the things that are out of frame. You're Terry, I'm gonna launch right into it because I was reading one of the articles that you'd sent me about
All right.
specialization. You're gonna get me in trouble today because I'm gonna try and restrain. I'm gonna try and refrain from saying anything that's not backed up by objective facts and some amount of research and can't be corroborated. So if I what I want to say, I'll tell you what I want to say, but I'm not going to say it
No,
as my
say it.
position. I'm going to say what I want to say. What I want to say is that national borders are a pointless abstraction, and all research around international trade is built on the fabrication of national borders, which in reality mean nothing.
Well, I think you're seeing the undoing of that today, at least in the West.
I'm almost like a border that counts is a giant wall or a mountain range or an ocean. That stuff counts as a border because it's an actual obstacle. But the border between Virginia and Maryland is not a relevant border.
That's the interesting. I don't even know what Taylor and Francis Online is, but the journal is Economics of Innovation and New Technology, and that's the crux of the article. That article is that technological specialization regionally, obviously, this felt like the biggest breaking news headline, "The sun is in the sky" article, that technological specialization regionally is directly tied to the economic output of that region. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That'll happen.
also the sky is blue. Um, so I think let me start. You dropped a bomb, I'll drop a bomb, and then we'll dive into it. I think of specialization, and I think you have to in parallel tracks. There's the tract of commerce and GDP and economic engines, country, state, region, global, hemisphere, all that. But there's the cultural impact of specialization too. And I'm equally interested in both.
Yeah, and
Um,
a border that exists between a specialist barber versus in one town or in one region versus another region that specializes in olive oil. If I have Barber Town and Olive Oilville, it that is a meaningful border between where does the olive oilville. I don't remember which one was a ville, but when does the olive oil specialization end, and where does the barber specialization begin? That makes sense. But then to have an additional imagined border at at the neighborhood, then the city, then the state, then the national level, ban them all. Ban them all, and we'll just go to de facto borders based on when everybody starts having bad haircuts but great crusty bread.
well, I think the great equalizer of geographic borders has been the internet, and there's you know I think people are essentially outside of some legacy laws, and I think we're working through, however painfully that is, and that whole topic of conversation is not. I'm interested in it, but I'm not interested in the tribalism surrounding immigration and borders and all that. But I think the internet has opened the possibility for not only global trade but global employment, and we're seeing that. I think the really progressive tech companies have found ways, either through vertical integration or through um, means that we don't maybe fully grasp, but they found ways to leverage talent wherever it exists.
We have to take two steps back here because you sent me a number of pieces to review which I partially reviewed, and there's two reasons that I partially reviewed them. Number one, uh, I don't read fast. Number two, at least two of the three things you sent me are academic articles, scholarly journal articles. So we need to talk about reading these as a person who is not a professional scholar. And I want to know your take about. I want to know how you approach a journal article or a scholarly work in that. It's the form itself of a journal article, meaning academics have submitted per a specific academic template to a conference for its proceedings to be published, or to a journal which is edited by other people in that field, and there is a peer review process. Basically, what I just said is the Wikipedia version of academic publishing. Tell me about approaching that from a regular person point of view.
Well, first off, the Yale article is obnoxious. It's obnoxious. I it feels like some of these Ivy League schools. I've got to get my rant in first, and then I'll
Please do.
address your question.
Please.
It feels like some of these Ivy League schools are the ethos is that of a top 40 rapper, and they just want to tell you
Go on.
they want to tell you over and over how sound methodologically they are, and how it's just a lot of the article was about the data that they used, as opposed to maybe ferreting out or teasing out the tenets of the discussion.
That's interesting, because I take kind of a I agree with your assessment of that particular piece, but I also take a completely different view about what I'm looking for. If I'm reading a scholarly work, I'm looking for no more than a few paragraphs of conclusion and recommendation. And those can be separate. It can be, here is a set of recommendations and here is a conclusion in a 5 or 6 page piece with some figures and some numbers and some discussion of methodology. I want to have your recommendations be narrow, and I want to be able to get through that in a page. I want every sentence to have a bunch of punch to it. And then I want to be able to, me or you or somebody else or anybody else that's reading it, be able to pick apart that methodology. So you end up with this giant chunk of, this is how we did it and why it's legit. Here's a tiny little bit of, here's our conclusion. But from my perspective, reading something that is an academic work, as opposed to, Nature or Science magazine, or, God forbid, the newspaper, um, I want to see the excruciating details publicized, not because I'm going to pick it apart, but because someone should be able to pick it apart. And that's a big difference to me between reading conclusions and commentary versus reading research, in its true form.
And that is what you just said is my answer to your question.
Yeah.
That's the way I prefer to consume it as well. But I think embedded in any academic article, even if it's not heavy on ideology, and by ideology, I mean the positions of its authors, I think the data should tell a story. And this felt like just a lot of data for data's sake.
Right. Right.
And that's a bone that I have to pick with data science generally, or data and statistics generally, is it should tell a story. And this does not.
The thing I like about the other, this is also very particular to interpreting academic research, is most publications they don't exist to come to a big or significant conclusion. They
For sure.
exist to come to a small conclusion and to add to the body of literature, meaning the total collected work demonstrating examples of how a thing can be done. So if Terry's mixing Mentos and Diet Coke, and he's done 400 trials with Fanta and regular Coke and Dr. Pepper and Minty Mentos, and he's got one set of results, each, he doesn't have to do the entire experiment for every brand of soda, every type of Mentos forever, and publish that under one, grand sweeping life's work. You can publish that a bit at a time and say, we've incrementally discovered that the orange sodas have more of an impact on the height and breadth of the Coca-Cola fizz explosion. I honestly, it's like academic publishing exists to take all of the fun and joy out of things that would otherwise be fun experimentation by writing them down as dryly and methodically as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's a discussion that we should have at some point, is that specifically. But I think the Yale article and these articles, the writings, the more scholarly writings that we've read about the origins of specialization, because
Right.
that's what we're it's what we're thinking about, and we're thinking about it in terms of technology and what's the relationship between culture and technology through the prism of specialization.
Yeah. The
And
origins and the challenges today of specialization, or the drawbacks, or the ebb and flow.
so that's why I think you have to evaluate the raw mathematical discussion of data. What's the GDP and highly special? How do you define highly specialized? What is the GDP? What are the sort of raw metrics? How do you define specialization in that context, and what are the raw metrics around that? That's one discussion. But the other discussion, and there's an historical context to this that I'm really interested in, is what are the cultural impacts, and the sort of benchmark baseline example that I'll give you, and curious to get your take on, is all the way back to the beginning, the Industrial Revolution, when both at its inception and sort of as it was gaining momentum in the UK and in the US, there was a decentralized model at that time where families worked together as a form of commerce. So one family, and the example in the article that I sent to you, or the journal that I sent to you, was, or maybe I didn't send it. This was more not geo, but it was basically referencing a family pre-industrial revolution would invest in a spinning loom and would make textile for a bigger company, and that was the family's business in addition to farming, etc. And the Industrial Revolution took at first the man, the male, the patriarch of the household, of the family, took him out of the family dynamic and took him into an urban working dynamic, which, not a value assessment, it absolutely changed the dynamic of that culture of the family. And then soon after that, and less common for some period of time, but soon after that, single women left the family dynamic and were not just single women, but women left and were in the working population as well. Also changed culturally the big umbrella, the big cultural umbrella of the country, but in that community and in that family changed culturally as well. Again, not a value assessment, but I'm interested in that interplay, because specialization, that's one area where I think you have to evaluate the cultural impact along with the technological.
Well, so there's a one-to-one line. I have a question for you, but I'll come back to it in a second. There's a straight line between um, identity as a specialist in a thing and becoming a specialist in that thing. So if you're identifying as the thing that you are specialized in, and your self image and your self worth and everything about yourself and your perception of who you are and what you do become intertwined. And that can be what you do in the sense that I go to church every Sunday, or what you do is I am a musician, or what you do is I'm an office worker in X, Y, and Z industry, or whatever, or I'm a teacher, or I'm a police officer. Like, take your pick. It is very, very hard to become truly specialized in an area that you're spending most of your working waking time, and not have that bleed into how what you identify as a as being your personality becoming the thing that you do. And I think the backlash against that's, yeah, I wouldn't say it's widespread, but certainly there's been a lot of ink spilled and songs written about what it means to have your entire identity tied up in your work as opposed to something else.
For sure. And I think that is a relatively new, and I think that's in line with what I was just saying about the
certainly in the
Industrial
last
Revolution.
certainly in the last 75 years or so.
Yeah, very much. And I think that's sad. I think that's really sad. There's, I do. I think I don't think it's call it a problem, whatever. I think it's sad because the things I like the old model culturally. I like specialization technologically because I think it's better for. I think it's. I think we'd agree from a convenience perspective and in terms of being able to preserve food and a lot of the things that have been bottlenecks for us evolutionarily are not anymore because of technological advancements and specialization. But I think it's brought with it as a co-pilot, it's brought with it a number of cultural problems that didn't exist as well. And I think it's sad when a person reduces him or herself to the scope of their work, and that is it.
All right,
I
here's a counterpoint.
Okay.
Where you're from Kentucky, right?
I live in Kentucky.
Do you identify as being from Kentucky?
Yeah, of course.
And I am from Virginia and identify as being from Virginia. What is it, the substitute that you're talking about now, going back in time, would be I identify as Virginian, you identify as Kentuckian, and that's arbitrary. Why? Like what makes me Virginian? And I think it's so a substitute of I am a thing that I have control over versus my birthplace, or I'm the son of my father. Like okay, great. So the culture of one, and I don't, also no one made this happen. This just evolved over time, but the trend of wanting to feel a sense of agency over your identity came part and parcel with all sorts of individualism and libertarian in the sense of liberty oriented thinking. This was the formation of the United States on individualism and sometimes rugged individualism, and it's tough to be ruggedly individualistic if everything that's important to me about who I am is based on the fact that I live here, which is an arbitrary accident of fate, as opposed to I'm a skilled car mechanic, and therefore I have created my identity as a skilled car mechanic.
I think I'm painting a picture of the cultural nuance, for lack of a better word, but I'm painting a picture of that, the change that happened in parallel with technological specialization.
Mm-hmm.
Culturally, I'm romanticizing that, and that's not my point. That's not my intent. Honestly, I think that family, and this would probably get me into trouble, but I think
More or less than when to abolish all geographic borders worldwide.
I don't think that's a very popularly held, that we're seeing that happen in real time
Yeah, but
today.
Terry, what about drugs? We'll be flooded with drugs. What about
Well,
criminals? The criminals will flood into the countries of the good guys, and the bad guys will just be upon our shores.
I mean, you can make a case that that's true. It doesn't necessarily render the happenings or the fact that it should. I mean, this has been the way this has gone, whether people want to hear this or not. This is the way it's gone for a long time, and
I'm a
any
huge fan. I'm a huge fan of the enclosure movement. Putting a fence around your pasture to delineate it as your own. I'm a big fan. It's more state borders that I have an issue with.
I have this profound cultural point to make.
I know. I'm trying to make you work for it.
I know you are. It's really not profound, but I think people want to, and I'm a victim of this in a lot of instances too, or I tend to do this. People want to romanticize the past because it's no longer, it's a narrow interpretation of what the past actually was.
Exactly.
And I think that pre-industrial revolution thought of the nuclear family as this holistic, altruistic thing is false. I think it was a thing based on necessity people, not across the board, but I think it's more so the case. It was an economic necessity. You had to have people to, you had to have, this was the little group of people that you had that helped you survive. And I don't think necessarily that it's this, um, Hallmark card episode that seemingly I'm painting it as by saying that that was the cultural norm pre-industrial revolution, and what's evolved after is that was good, this is bad. I'm not making that point because I don't think we know the intent. I think it was more necessity than choice. Then that's my
Do you
personal opinion.
do you think that do you think specialization is innate in humans and or nature?
I think it's absolutely the case in both. I was going to say nature and human, it's all the same thing, but I think there's a desire to refine, and a constant move to entropy in nature. I think evolution, there's been a lot of science done on this topic over the years. I think we nature, the big capital N, nature selects for the most advantageous thing over time. And I think that's we're all a product of that. That's what I think.
I am I I am so when I think about physics or calculus, there were physics before there was science to call it physics. There was, calculus as a method to represent, physical things and do calculations on physical phenomena. Those things existed in the sense that they were they had just not been classified, categorized, explained, and written down per se. So I think specialization, oddly enough, is a very similar sort of situation where specialization is innate in nature. So you have you know, anytime you see an animal evolve to its circumstances, that's specialization towards living in a desert versus living in a forest, right? So specialization generationally clearly exists, but the science, the research, the popular discussion, the reporting on and researching into specialization as it relates to means of production. So how an economy operates, who does what, where money comes from, where goods and services come from, all of that stuff had to be expressed as ideas that somebody could then talk about and publish more research on and dig into. So then we really only have like 150 years of research on specialization, whereas we have 500 years of research on physics and thousands of years of research on chemistry and alchemy, right? So it's funny to me that we are living where debates rage about specialization. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it a continuum? Is there a spring back and forth between countries tend to specialize, then they tend to generalize, then they tend to specialize again, then they tend to generalize. And while that pendulum may have been swinging for as long as societies have existed, there was no science to be evaluating it, so nobody knows. So we're kind of at like the beginning of the science of even digging into this as a topic, which is crazy to me because I love thinking that we're the most modern and contemporary culture to have ever existed, and we know most of the stuff now, which is not true.
I made this point last week, and this is one of the things I'm going to plant my flag in as an ideological position that I think is necessary. It's important. I think the gap between the technology, the specialization that is happening today digitally with applied math, applied science, applied statistics, and computer science, the gulf between the general population's understanding of that technology widens versus 30 years ago, when we largely more or less understood mechanical systems because we had to use them. So this is probably my number one point that I want to emphasize, and I think is my prism on specialization. I think it's necessary, but I think there's a problem embedded in today's culture, and I don't think it's debatable, is that the the general public is further and further and further removed from the technology transforming their society today than they were 30 years ago. And that's a real problem. From an industrial standpoint, companies can't execute on what it is they say they're doing. Only the tip of the spear knows how to execute applied AI. Only the tip of the spear. And can you run a corporation that way? And I think it's going to change business models moving forward. That's one aspect. But the other aspect is in commercial applications, in the way we live our lives daily, we know how to use the end technology of digital specialization. We know how to use apps, by and large, apps and computers and smartphones. There is maybe 0.01%, and I'm in this category, knows the mechanics of making a cell phone or making a computer or making the router work in your home. And I think that's a point, that's something that has happened over the past 30 years that is not a good thing.
I am I am not going to argue a second time. I'm simply going to tell you that I disagree with your basic premise, and leave it at that. But I will observe that I think.
Here's let me just say this and then finish
Yeah,
your thought. So my example of this is my father. My father has an eighth grade education and was a semi driver. Uh, I've seen him tear apart engines, rebuild engines. He knows how to build houses. He built a bathroom or addition on our home growing up that he did the electrical. He ran the plumbing, did the drywall, built, framed, did the entire thing. So that would not happen today with digital technology in any form or capacity unless it's the highly specialized person that's undertaking that process.
I completely agree with your observation of the facts, meaning that was true for your dad and is not true today. I do not make the same. I don't jump to the same conclusion from the facts. I also think that I'm probably a specialization zealot in the sense that I am, you know, pretty extreme in my opinion that specialization is perfectly fine. It's the way of the world. I wouldn't quite go so far as to say that it's good, more that I don't have an opinion as to whether it's good or bad, and I'm not sure it's even a thing that can be measured as good or bad. I would say that specialization exists, and I hold a pretty strong point of view that specialization has always existed in largely in the extreme, and that the conclusions to draw about uh, what that means has more to do with uh, the time, the place, and the thing, and there are actions that should take place based on: are there a lot of specialists here? Are there a lot of generalists? Are there a lot of people that have specialized in a thing that's no longer applicable to their life? If you've become a specialist at living in the desert, and this is whether you're a person or whether you're an animal or plant species, but if you're a specialist at living in the desert, and then their desert is flooded over and over and over again because of a change in weather patterns, well, that's a big problem because you're a specialist in the wrong thing. And I think that being a specialist in the wrong thing is a really valid pain point. So if let's call it 30 years ago, there was widespread specialization in plumbing, electrical, masonry, woodworking, metalworking, and forklift driving, right? Like the stuff to keep up your homestead. If that is no longer a valuable set of skills, that's a huge problem. Or if suddenly there's a new set of skills that's required because some other thing is much much more important than that, that's also a huge problem. So do you know the specializations for insects quote? Have you heard this before?
Ah,
Okay, so this is from a book, and this story goes somewhere that you weren't expecting, that you won't necessarily be expecting. So the quote is, this is from a Robert Heinlein book. A human being should be able to change a diaper, plan an invasion, butcher a hog, con a ship, design a building, write a sonnet, balance accounts, build a wall, set a bone, comfort the dying, take orders, give orders, cooperate, act alone, solve equations, analyze a new problem, pitch manure, program a computer, cook a tasty meal, fight efficiently, die gallantly. Specialization is for insects. It's very like It's
I,
very. I feel like it's
that's
catching
the
the
opposite.
spirit.
That's the opposite of what you say, though.
Right, right. So hold on, bear with me. That quote is not a Robert Heinlein quote. It's a it's a character in a Robert Heinlein novel who travels time to seduce his mother. And the point of that quote is to characterize this person as a certain type of person. But that doesn't stop people from pulling the quote out and, making it a meme and waving their flag about how much of a generalist they are because they can, change their own oil.
So here is not a value assessment, but here is the progression in my family. And I don't know that anything can or cannot be extrapolated from this. I explained just a moment ago how many things my father can do:
Yeah.
engines, construct, anything, literally anything.
Well, no,
I
that's an important point. It is not literally anything.
mechanical, mechanical. If he doesn't know how to do it, he tinkers until he does. And I think
It's still not going to be anything.
he's
There's
not
got
building bombs, or he's not building a CNC machine. Of course, it's not literally anything, but
it matters.
that one would encounter in their homestead, on your house. Anyway, I can do some of those things, a lot of those things. I'm very handy, I'm very practical, but I'm way less generalized than he is. And you get to my son can do none of those things and is not handy at all and has to hire out everything. So I think
How old's your
they're
son?
21,
How old's your dad?
70.
He's got a minimum of 55 years on your son.
Yeah, but he could do it at 15, 16. And that's the point, is that you had to do those things in prior generations out of necessity. You had to, you didn't have the financial means, first off, and you might have to go 100 miles to the next big town to find someone who specialized in that. So you had to develop those specialties on your own. Um, I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying it is.
Right,
And
exactly. And that's the place where we're in complete agreement, which is there was and I will even go so far as to say a typical contemporary American is less self-sufficient than a typical contemporary, or we'll call it the family, right? So let's say the typical American nuclear family is less self-sufficient now than 50 or 100 years ago.
for sure,
I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to say.
for
Although
sure.
I would also say that I have no way of proving what I just said. I'm just willing to give that as a likely
Well,
scenario.
how do you define self-sufficient is another thing. I mean, that it's a big, broad. Anyway, go ahead, finish your point. I'm sorry.
Oh, I feel like my point was that it's a big, broad, difficult brush to paint with. And
Yeah,
so people, I don't take a lot of, I don't have a lot of patience. Not that you're telling me this, but if someone is personally explaining to me the stuff that kids don't know how to do today, or the stuff that their kids don't know how to do, or that, God forbid, all kids today don't know how to do, it's difficult for me to keep my eyes from rolling directly out of my head because it's an argument as old as time, and it's so hard to quantify that. And there's a nugget of truth behind you know I think the piece that's interesting is the ability to generalize versus specialize, or the things that people specialize in, has changed over time, and that shift over time is a meaningful thing to observe, and it's a useful thing to observe, and understanding how people learn and thrive and grow across time, that is interesting by itself. So to flip that on its head and instead basically gripe about the lack of sameness between one set of people and another set of people across time, it seems like it's missing the interesting point for the sake of, you know taking the easy pot shot.
here's where it matters, though. I agree with you, but here's where it matters: is the fewer things via specialization that you know how to do, collectively you know how to do, the more dependent you are on finding the skills that you need to maintain a lifestyle.
Right.
And that's a general statement. But there are fewer people with the skills that have the knowledge and skill to do the things that you need to do because you don't know how to do them. So we talked about this in competency crises. There are fewer tradespeople. There are a lot of, we're about to age out a lot of domain knowledge on how to plumb, how to be an electrician, how to weld, how to things.
Citation needed, but okay.
Well, I mean, you can shake a stick and find the metrics associated with baby boomers at the age of retirement who own small businesses that are up for going to go off into the oblivion. I mean, there are a number of, what is it? What is the number of small businesses? Like
It's half of people in the United States are employed in at small or medium businesses, so less than 50 people.
point is I maybe we still have the positive equilibrium. Maybe the equation is balanced on, even with the need for specialized skills, because fewer people have the general skill base to do things that only, you know, people in prior generations had. Even with that, maybe there's an equilibrium and we still have plenty of people with the skill and domain knowledge to satisfy that. I think that's not the case.
So in order to avoid a rhetorical argument, I will defer to mercantilism as a well-studied historical trend, and say that the economic academic space still has lots of debates about about globalization and about industrial policy and about trade policy, and none of the stuff that you and I are talking about is a settled debate among people who spend all day every day doing nothing but researching and arguing about these topics. So it is absolutely positively an open question. Chalk this one up to things that humanity has not yet solved, right? So that's kind of my first point. And then the other thing I would say, maybe to progress things or maybe not to progress things, is that it's really dangerous to talk about general, specialization, specialized skill set versus general skill set when there's no actual baseline for that. So it's not difficult to picture a farmer who is spinning their own wool and raising, cattle or sheep on the side, or as their subsistence farming, plus a little bit of um, trade goods being built as well, bemoaning the lack of generalized skills that your father had, right? But then a third generation beyond that, it's bemoaning the lack of generalized skills that exist now. So a person can only know a certain amount of things. That's it. And the ability to know all of the things and know the stuff that somebody else knew is not a criteria for their success. Knowing the things that
Sure.
are going to get them success are the criteria for getting to success. So putting up a, even it would be ridiculous if I said, Terry, you don't know the things I know, and that's a problem, right? So by one person, we already agree specialization exists and is good. There's a bunch of things that I don't know. There's a bunch of things I know that you don't know, and it would be utterly ridiculous to sit here and be like, Terry, you should know what I know. But then you apply it to, a town or a state or a country or a generation, and the exact same argument that would seem silly if you were talking about two people suddenly seems totally different when you're talking about society wide. And I'm not saying that it is or isn't totally different. I'm just saying if you reduce it down to specialization at its at its absolute extreme, I think there are parallels there that get forgotten when you're just talking about, America versus China, for example, or baby boomers versus Zoomers, for example.
Yeah. Read an interesting article in, I think it was called FL Science, a journal, this morning, about how there was a clay tablet found in, I think, Lebanon, that had the Pythagorean theorem etched into the tablet, aged 1,000 years before we thought previously. And I found that fascinating.
I mean, I want to just make a joke about how stone tabulature skills have really gone to crap, but that seems mean spirited.
kind of a timely quote or
Um,
timely point.
uh, there was I'm forgetting who it was specifically, but I think it was Socrates was pretty against the written word because it was going to rot the brains of kids today, who would no longer have to spend time memorizing things, and therefore they would become intellectually lazy.
So that's my most, I think, Russ headspace point is that whole concept of, well, my generation was raised running through creeks and in the woods and lighting fires and outside and riding bikes and that sort of thing. I think that those are great skills for developing farmers and that sort of thing. I think that having there is a balance, but I think that the whole discussion of screen time is in line with what we're talking about today, because you want to encourage kids to be comfortable and familiar with how to make digital things happen.
You know what I think
And
you and Socrates would have in common?
what's that?
You'd place a really high value on thirst for knowledge, right?
There's a whole bunch of people that fit into that.
I mean, because that sure it's a spectrum, but the opposing ends of that spectrum are you are willfully ignorant or you're thirsty for knowledge.
Yeah. I can't, and this is, ah, man, that,
I think being willfully being where you will get me to agree with you and Socrates aggressively is that I will put a value judgment directly on being willfully ignorant is actually a problem. It's destructive. It's correctable. It's teachable at a society level how not to be like that. And the dumbing of society as a like a pivot towards if I could quantify the fact that society is becoming more willfully ignorant, if I had a way to quantify that, or if I suddenly had like a perfect statistics telling me that, I would say, wow, this is a huge problem and we need to fix it. Given the fact that I don't have perfect numbers to measure hostility towards, learning and ability to thirst for knowledge, since I don't have a statistic, I'll just wave my hands and say that everything's basically fine.
no, I think there are metrics for that. I think if you look at how we place globally at certain ages in math and science scores, reading in the industrialized world, obviously, I think if you watch our trend, it's not a positive or favorable trend. And I
The
think
countries that outpace us in those types of attainment have extremely low rates of inbound migration. So you have a dramatically lower rate of people who are starting from a lower bar to achieve, test score based metrics.
uh, so.
I think we should do a one by one, I have a lightning round to take to try and come up with a comeback for each for each completely valid point, and I have to do all of them off the top of my head.
So if your point is, and it very well, I
I think my
mean,
point is just the statistics are hard. I think that's my main point.
how much more immigration is there today than there was in the 1910s and 1920s, and what's the ratio of performance on standardized tests or some measure of knowledge?
It's an apples to oranges comparison because now we're talking about rate of immigration across two different time cohorts compared country to country. So we're not comparing is the same geography more stupid today. We're saying is the same geography more or less stupid compared to, for example, Japan at math and science tests. And you can't say we don't have enough information to say we need Japan relative we need Japan's immigration numbers today and at a previous point in the past. We need the United States immigration numbers today at a previous point in the past, and we need the same tests being measured then and now. And much though I would like to have those numbers in hand and drop a big truth bomb about the statistics, aka defer to what the numbers actually say instead of talk out of my butt, those numbers the numbers don't exist, so
They
we
do.
can't make the comparison.
Yeah, they do. I have the studies.
What decade of test scores are you talking about? The 70s?
I don't
Standardized
know.
testing didn't even exist in this way. Like I have a we need to like narrow our decades down because we jump back and forth between how things were in the late 1800s versus how things were in the 70s versus how things were when I was a child, and they all just keep blurring together for whatever rhetorical point each of us is trying to make, and we end up talking in circles.
I will say this, no metrics to back this up.
That
I
hasn't stopped
think,
me.
yeah, me either. But here's the thing. This is
Can we get t-shirts coordinated? I'm gonna get specialist and you're gonna get generalist.
generalist. I'd wear that shirt
Yeah, I'd wear that shirt.
in a second. Here's the thing. So what if there are some, the statistics game is a Ponzi scheme most of the time anyway. There are, you can Paul Krugman is a great example of this. You can be really well versed in statistics and still make flawed crap arguments. Um, anyway, I
Is he
think,
Lexus in the olive tree?
what's that?
Did he write Lexus in the olive tree? Or is
Oh, he's a,
that's the other Tom. Oh,
nope.
who did you say? Paul Krugman?
Yeah.
Oh, I get him and Tom Friedman confused because they have names with the same number of syllables and were popular at the same time, but they're very much not the same guy.
They're pretty much the same
I
guy.
stopped reading Paul Krugman in a different decade. It's been several decades.
Yeah. You know,
Today I learned I guess he's still around.
that's been the biggest, again, I talk openly about disillusionment from sort of getting to peek behind the curtain as I've gone from my origins to where I am now. That's another area of, like, I revered certain media institutions and intellectual writers, and it's that is not the case now, at all. I think, and I'll leave it at that. But I think that is, along with thinking that if you were an executive at a Fortune 500 company, you had to know what you were doing. If you're a writer for the New York Times, or choose your hallowed institution, you had to be intellectually really, really rigorous. And both of those have let me down.
I I've been jaded for as long as I can remember, which has its own downsides.
That's why so we're banting statistics about as the ultimate weapon, and that's why I made those points.
I think as an exploration of specialization, I think that this is an effective exploration because it seems like such a tedious, boring topic, and it is. I mean, it's fraught with peril. There's so much room for. I mean, there are conclusions that you can draw about how people should live their lives, about how policies should be made, about how taxes should be levied, about what businesses should be prioritized and deprioritized, about educational beliefs and education systems. Like everything can. There's so many things that can come back down to these extremely shaky basis for a belief, and it's a belief in the sense that it is not well backed up by facts about how things work at a very basic level. So I mean, I'll call it in economics, but like I don't want this to be an economics podcast, but I'll say that because it lacks a better term. But it's crazy to me how much difficulty there is in getting this tedious, dull, boring seeming subject of, well, people should specialize and know how to, like, if you were to just tell me in a vacuum specialization is good and explain to me all the reasons why specialization is good, I would be right there with you, and I'd be thumbs up and be like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Specialization is good. If you were to give me a carefully reasoned, well defended argument about why specialization is bad, I would be equally adamant that you're absolutely right and specialization is bad. And I would be like totally left with where do I even go? Which way is up? Because I just think everybody's got a great point here, and
Here's my
unable to move forward.
here's my most progressive view, and by progressive I mean future oriented, thinking about how the future looks in terms of work. I think the corporate America, especially in the industrial sense, as the all-powerful behemoth is going to succumb to specialization. I
I
think
could see that.
I think the concept that Siemens or General Electric or choose your company can do can make on one end of the spectrum make turbines and can make all of these heavy industrial things, and at the other end of the spectrum can also be highly advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence sources of product output from that is preposterous because they're different skills. And that's my point about the gulf between, for generations, the executive leadership of a Siemens or a General Electric has been really close. If you're a mechanical engineer, even if there is a digitization or improvements in the way your pumps work or your turbines work, you still understand the technology of turbines and of pumps, of mechanical systems. This is a different ballgame. Artificial intelligence, pushing data around, making decisions with AI is a different ballgame that those companies don't have the expertise top to bottom to execute. So I think you see microservice providers, and I think there's a push for this where you have little specialists that execute for those companies in areas where it's needed.
You heard it here first. That's the future, according to Terry, and I agree with him.
I don't. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
What are we talking about tomorrow?
Um. Oh, stoicism.
that, that's going to be quite a pivot.
Well, it's a obviously it's our take on aspects of stoicism. We're not going to have a philosophical debate on, you know, Marcus Aurelius
We're going to
or
talk about
any of them.
stoicism in regular people's lives. Are you the one that told me that you uh, began to study? No, it wasn't you. This is probably a podcast I was listening to, somebody else's. They'd sort of formed a worldview, and then they discovered the Stoics, and they're like, oh, I'm just I'm just thinking what these guys wrote down. I don't know where I picked it up, but I mean, my whole philosophy already exists, and it's just Stoicism. And they kind of like wandered into it in their mid to late 20s. They're like, oh, it turns out I'm a Stoic.
I straddle it, but I think what we'll talk about it tomorrow. But I think what we're interested in, we talk about a lot about the culture of technology and the culture of industrial corporations, that sort of thing, because that's an interesting aspect of it. And I think that's the part that we want to evaluate tomorrow is, as you know, again, through a historical lens, have companies is the culture of industrial and corporate America moving from respecting or selecting for stoicism to more emotionalism, individualism? And is that at odds with productivity? You know, obviously we're going to say right here, there's no way to evaluate that from a metric standpoint, but just a thought exercise, because I know there is a move away from certain ideals, at least.
Identity politics in the C-suite. That's going to be the title.
No identity
We got to
politics,
get
but
clicks. We got to get clicks and views. We need to pound that like and subscribe button. Can't do it without a clickbaity headline.
yeah,
All right.
are we gonna turn into the smoking jacket people that just wake up and or the robe, put our robe on and throw red meat over the lanai?
I see. My issue is I have a I have an inferiority complex that I haven't quote unquote done enough. So when I hear stuff about how I don't know how to change the oil or fix the air conditioner or, you know, thatch my own roof or whatever the heck it is, I'm like, yeah, you're not talking in the abstract about a generation. You're talking about me personally, and I know lots of things. And if some old person is like, you don't know how to do this or that or the other thing, I'd be like, what is your problem? Why would you bring that up? There's a ton of stuff I know. Also, I would love to learn new things. Are you here to teach me things, or are you here to take a crap on the stuff I don't know? I know, by the way, if you're 30 years older than me, of course you have 30 years more knowledge than me. Apparently, you didn't gain the wisdom to shut your mouth and not insult somebody to their face. I probably wouldn't say that, but I'd be thinking,
Yeah. Well, I will say this. I think one of the problems, again, that can't be measured, I don't think, but I think one of the problems that I think about with specialization is from an informed voter standpoint. I feel like, this sounds good anyway, that a lack of sort of problem solving from if you own a house or a farm and you have to work through a bunch of things, you're more receptive and open to nuance and complexities from a policy standpoint. I feel like today that specialization has dumbed us down to sound bites, and we vote perception because we can't handle the real mechanics of sausage making of policy. Like, policy is government. That's what you're voting for. You're not voting for the perception. These people are
right?
they're selling you things like and you're not paying attention because you can't handle the complexity of policy. You're not paying attention
Ooh,
to the important things.
I want to talk about specialization and generalization in day-to-day policy making. That would be fascinating. Not a political argument, just a how does policy actually get made or fail to get made, and what's the role of specialization and generalization there? Let's bring that up another day.
And just answer this question for me as we go. I'm always, it's the chicken and the egg cliche, whatever that thing is. Is it that the apparatchik is dumbing down what the people want? Or is it that the people are them dumbing themselves down and the apparatchik is giving them what they can handle? Because one of those things is happening.
That's not a question you want me to answer. That's a song that needs to be written.
I like what, which is it? Because again, I've made the point a few times. I feel like I'm watching a different movie. And this is not a tribal political thing. It's a, people are voting for, facades and characters that have been created and have no idea the policy implications of those votes. None.
That's
Very,
true.
very few people pay attention to the policy implications of their vote. That can't be debated because there's anyway. I'm just curious. Is that these crafty, cunning politicians are so clever and so good at what they do that they're dumbing the population down? Or is it that the population would rather watch the NFL and make TikToks and take selfies, and specialization can't handle the sort of complexities of policymaking? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but it's a fascinating thought exercise.
Hanlon's razor, never ascribe to malice what can be explained by
Competence. Yeah.
simple incompetence.
Yeah.
All right. See you tomorrow for Stoicism.
Have a good one.
Bye, Terry.